touch a couple of axes that exists within the Israeli society, that, or a couple of lines that along these lines you can find some of the, or may I say that this line is prominent in every kind of discussion that is about to come or that takes place with regard to the Israeli society. One of those lines, of those axes, is the question of the nation or the nationality. You have Jews on one side and Arabs on the other. Both of them live in Israel, exist in Israel. But this axis is quite prominent whenever you touch the question of Israeli culture, Israeli society, Israeli education, Israeli economy, who's doing which kind of work. Another axis is old versus new. People who have been there in Israel, let's say 60, 80, 100 years ago, versus newcomers. Sabre is the name in Israel for those who were born in Israel, versus immigrants, or people who recently came. And there is a bipolar word when it comes to that. Either your family is Ashkenazi is coming from Ashkenaz, which is a general name for people who came from Europe, European countries, and you can put in the same group people who, or families who immigrated from America to Israel. That's one side. Or Sfaradi, Sefarad. That's the Hebrew name for Spain, but practically speaking, that's another term to describe Israeli families who came from Asia or Africa. And this is quite another interesting axis, because one could have thought that after Israel is already standing as an independent state 63 years, and then this independent society 120 years, the question of what is your origin shouldn't be with any importance. However, the situation is that this is one of the most interesting questions within the Israeli society, even nowadays. And it doesn't matter that both the parents of two different people were born in Israel. Still, the question of where the grandparents came from is still an interesting question. Why? Because it has social significance. Why? Because it has cultural importance. Why? Because there are differences in mentality, in perception, in approach, in so many issues. And this is still a very interesting line or axis that you can find in the Israeli society, and that affects everything. Another line is the religious versus the secular versus the ultra-religious. Charedim. Charedim is a general name, that's a Hebrew word, for the ultra-religious people. There are some like those in Israel. You can easily recognize them according to black clothes, as if they were taken from scenes in Europe in the middle of the 18th century. This is not a huge group in the Israeli society, but they have a lot of political power. Another line, which I think we can find in all countries, is male versus female, men versus women. This is also an interesting question, and we can see later on that even that question is not natural when it comes to Israel. Let me remind you, this is a country where army service is mandatory, but not just for men, but for women as well. When we're speaking about Israeli society, another one is town versus country, town versus countryside. Also an interesting phenomenon. We will come to it. So all of those axes we can speak of when we're speaking about Israeli society. Last survey that was done at the end of 2010 says that there are 7.5 million inhabitants in Israel. Now, this is a relatively small to a medium-sized country, more or less the size of some European countries, a little bit bigger than Finland or Norway. It's a little bit smaller than Hungary. Hungary is like 10 million people. But what is interesting to see is that when we're checking the combination of how is the distribution, we can see that 70% out of those 7.5 million are Jewish. Okay, and this is important. 20% are Arabs, both Muslims and Christians, because there are also Arabs who are not Muslims or Christians, and you can find some of them in Israel, and 4.5 others. Others are either Christians who are non-Arabs or people who define themselves as without any religion. Now, when you are counting the 70% Jews, those are not necessarily just the Jews who practice Judaism on a daily basis, who go to the synagogue every weekend. I'm speaking about people who define either by the state or by the religious authority or by themselves as Jews. What you can see is that if we go to 1948, when the state was established, that at the time there was 80 to 83% of Jews and roughly 17-18% of Arabs. And this is not just a result of natural growth, there's also a question of immigration, and incoming immigration to Israel, which changes this balance, and it plays a little bit with the numbers. We will touch that soon during the lecture. And the question of immigration is rather important one, because this is one of the main source of the growth of the Israeli society, is the question of immigration. Just to put the quick figures, when Israel was established, there were 400,000 people in Israel. Now there are 7.5 million. Not all of them is a direct result of the natural growth. Israel as a state absorbed, since 1948, more than 3 million immigrants. Most of them, the vast majority is Jewish. And the question of immigration is still a very important one, and this is a pillar. If there is a law among the Israeli legislation which is called the law of return. And this is an important point, an important issue in the contemporary Israel. It is the chapter in the Israeli legislation. This is the law that gives the most or best describe how Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. Bearing in mind that Judaism and Jewish is not just a religion, it's also a nationality. Every Jewish person in the world has the right to immigrate to Israel, and by doing so also to acquire Israeli citizenship. Whether somebody wasn't born as Jewish and converted into Judaism, is he Jewish and thus eligible to immigrate to Israel? This is also an interesting question. The Israeli legislation says that he's a person that was born to a Jewish mother or that was converted into Judaism, and he's not a member of any other religion. What is quite clear that this balance or this ratio is on constant change. As you can see, for example, that between 48 and 60, only 30% of the growth was a direct result of a natural one, while almost 70% was due to immigration, people coming from the outside. If you take 83 to 89, you see that almost 90% of the growth was natural one, while only 10% is immigration. Why is that? Because there are waves of Jewish immigration into Israel. After the collapse of the former Soviet Union, Israel absorbed over 1 million of Jewish people from former Soviet countries who immigrated into Israel. Over 1 million over a period of less than a decade. The growth among the Israeli society is a combination of natural growth on one side and immigration on the other, and that the ratio between the natural growth and the immigration changes, along the years according to historical developments that we're going to touch those. Well, there are two chief rabbis. One, the Ashkenazi, the other one is the Sephardi. And this is, mind you, 63 years after the state was already established, and it's still, they are equal in position, and this one is responsible for this kind of synagogues, and the other one is responsible for the other kind of synagogue. And it doesn't represent different kind of Judaism. It's not like a difference between Catholics and Reformers and Lutherans. No, this is the same Judaism. Only the question of what is the origin, what is the background is different. This question, this tension between Ashkenazi and Sephardim, as I said, is quite there in the Israeli social discourse, political discourse. There are historical reasons, the waves of Zionism that established the Israeli society even before the state was established. Those who started to immigrate from Europe in the middle of the 19th century and onwards were mainly coming from Europe. They brought with them a certain perspective. And they brought with them not just a perspective, but the approach that was responsible for building the infrastructure of the Israeli society and the Israeli economy and the Israeli culture and the Israeli state during the first part of the 20th century. It's not that we're not Zionists and people, Jewish people who came from the Arab world before the establishment of Israel. There were, but in very small numbers that weren't, the portion of the society wasn't strong enough in order to make a difference. The state was established in 1948, and starting from 1948, we saw a couple of waves of immigration into Israel. The first one was between 1948 and 1951, where 700,000 were absorbed by the newly established state. That means, think of that, 400,000 people had to absorb 700,000 people within the course of 3 years. Out of those 700,000, at least half were people who came, were Jewish people who came from Africa and Asia, mainly from Arab countries. The second wave of immigration was during the 50s, and then most of it were people who came from Arab countries' background. That means that during the first 20 years of Israel, this balance between people with European background and people with Arab countries' background changed dramatically. And it changed also the political discourse, because since until 1977, the Israeli political system was predominant by political parties based on people who came from Europe. And those more than 500,000 and more who came from the other part of the world had very little political representation in the Israeli political system, and thus in the economy and the education, society, etc., etc. I'd like to mention two unique ways, communities in Israel. One of them is the kibbutz. It's a collective community with a strong socialistic approach. Basically, it's a group of people living together. The idea was to share, jointly a piece of land. The entire property was shared, it belonged to everybody. Nowadays it's no longer like that. Nowadays they are turning more and more into, yes, they are still maintaining some of this community approach, but now everybody gets a salary and no longer sharing a big dining room, and everybody is entitled to his own decision. Another alternative model is Moshav, which is another concept. This is a village. This is the closest thing that you can say about it. Also, it's a cooperative agricultural community where there is a strong idea of the difference between Moshav and Kibbutz. That in the Kibbutz you don't own anything. The collective owns everything. You don't have a private property. In the Moshav you have private property, you have private housing, but everybody got at the beginning the same piece of land, and